Bailey's Story, A Puppy Tale, Chapter 20. About a week later, Mom came to get me, and she took me on a car ride to a new place called the apartment. This was a small house built into a big building. There were dogs everywhere. Most of them were pretty little, but still kind of interesting. In the afternoons, Mom would take me out to see them in a big cement yard. She would sit on a bench and talk to people while I ran around making friends and marking territory. I didn't like the apartment very much. It was small and it didn't smell like home, and worst of all, the boy wasn't there. Felix the cat was, but that didn't help matters any. Both Mom and Dad left often, and they smelled like Ethan when they returned, but he wasn't living with us anymore, not eating at the table, not lying on the couch, not sleeping in one of the beds. Ethan used to be the one to feed me dinner, and now Mom had to do it. Before the fire, that had been the best part of my day, but now I didn't feel as hungry as I used to. Sometimes I even left food in the bowl. The strange apartment and the missing boy made my heart ache. I wandered from room to room, especially at night. I didn't want to sleep in a bed without Ethan. One night, while I was wandering, I poked my nose into a closet and found some boxes sitting there. I could smell something familiar inside one of them, so I got my teeth into a corner, dragged it out, and investigated. The flip! I'd know that smell anywhere. I got it out and carried it with me when I went back to my wandering. I didn't like the taste or the heavy feeling in my mouth, but I did it for Ethan. When he came back, he'd see that I had been waiting for him. A few days later, I was lying against the couch, asleep after a night of carrying the flip from room to room. Felix had curled up against me for a nap. I could feel his purr, such a giant sound for such a tiny thing, humming against my ribs. Ever since he'd come to the apartment, Felix had seemed to think that I'd become his mother. It was embarrassing, but I'd given up shoving him away. You can't really expect a cat to act like he's got brains. My ears picked up a bit when I heard Mom's car drive up outside. I jumped to my feet. Felix blinked at me in bewilderment and yawned as I trotted to the window and put my paws on the sill. My heart thumped and started racing, as if I'd been running around the yard. It wasn't just Mom getting out of the car. The boy, Ethan, was with her. I couldn't help myself. I was barking and spinning, racing to the door so I could get out to Ethan, racing back to the window so I could watch. Felix panicked and dove under the couch. When keys jangled in the lock, I was right back at the door, quivering. Mom opened the door a crack. Ethan's smell wafted in. I barked eagerly. My boy, finally! Now, Bailey, get back. Down, Bailey. Say down. Sit. Well, I couldn't do that. I briefly touched my rear end to the floor and then jumped up again, my tail thrashing in the air. Mom put her hand inside the room and snagged my collar, pushing me back as the door swung wide. Hey, Bailey. Hey, boy, Ethan said. Mom held me away from the boy as he limped in. He was leaning on two long sticks. Later, I learned that they were called crutches. He stumped awkwardly over to the couch while I danced and twisted and pulled at my collar, whimpering. Why wasn't Mom letting me go? Why was she keeping me back from my boy? Didn't she know how long I'd been waiting? At last she released my collar, and I threw myself across the room in one bound, landing in the boy's lap, kissing his face. Bailey, Mom said sturdily. No, it's okay, Bailey. You are such a doodle dog, the boy said, a smile easing the lines of exhaustion and pain in his face. How are you, huh? I missed you too, Bailey. Every time he spoke my name, I wiggled with happiness. The feel of his hands rubbing through my fur was heaven. The boy was back. But over the next few days, I began to understand that even though Ethan had come to live with us again, everything still wasn't right. I could tell from the way he stood and walked and the way his voice sounded that he was in pain. It wasn't just his leg that hurt. A mournful sadness drifted off of him, and sometimes a gloomy anger flared when all he was doing was sitting still, looking out the window. A few days after Ethan came home, There was a knock on the door, and when Mom opened it, the apartment filled up with boys. "Hi, Bailey! Hey, Bailey!" they called out. I recognized the smells. They were the boys who used to run up and down on the big field with Ethan, throwing the football back and forth between them. The boys laughed and talked and shouted and stood around half the day. Mom brought food from the kitchen and I got lots of bites, which made me happy. Ethan seemed happy too, but as soon as the boys had gone, the good feelings inside him drained away. Ethan got up using his crutches and limped into the room with our new bed where our new bed was. He sat on it, looking out the window. I followed him and jumped up to look too. I could see the group of boys leaving the apartment building. They jostled and pushed each other, and one pulled a ball out of his pocket. Another one raced down the sidewalk and caught the ball easily after the first one threw it as hard as he could. I could feel grief and anger and helplessness thud into Ethan like a rock. I shoved my head under his arm, but he didn't even lift a hand to pet me. For some reason, it felt as if we were lost again, out in the woods with nobody near. Then I had known what to do. I'd kept the boy warm, made sure he kept moving. I hadn't let him give up. How could I do that now? There was only one thing I could think of. I jumped down from the bed and nosed about in the corner of all the rooms until I found what I was looking for. I hurried back to Ethan and laid the flip in his lap. He looked down at it and shook his head. I jumped up on the bed beside him and flopped down a little whine in my throat. This time he lifted his hand to rub behind my ears, but I could tell that he was no happier. My whole life's dream is gone, Bailey, because of Todd, Ethan told me. I didn't understand what he was saying, but there was no mistaking the despair in his voice. It's not just football, he told me. I stirred the tip of my tail in a tiny wag. I recognized that word. Were we going to go back to the big field? It didn't seem as if we were. Ethan didn't budge. I can't do anything now, he said. Can't play sports, can't ride a bike, can't even run. I can walk, barely. His hand tightened for a minute in my fur. Because of Todd, he said again. I've got nothing left because of Todd. The days slowly grew warmer and tiny leaves came out on the trees. Ethan didn't use his crutches anymore. Now he walked with the help of a polished stick called a cane. The cane was very special, and I understood without anyone telling me that I wasn't supposed to chew on it, not even a little. There came a day with a lot of packing and carrying things out to the car, and then we all got to take a ride back to our old home. Everything looked the same, but it smelled different. Of fresh wood and paint and wallpaper. I carefully investigated every room, my nose busily working, and then burst through the dog door and into the backyard to let out a bark of joy. Duchess answered from down the street. Home! Ethan left every morning for school, just as he used to do. But I knew that he was no happier. He was tired when he came home, and his leg ached. I could tell by how heavily he leaned on the cane. He'd go into his room and lie down on the bed. Sometimes he didn't even come out for dinner. Mom and Dad would sit at the table and talk in low voices. Ethan would be in every other sentence. Not long after we'd come back to the house, Mom woke Ethan up early one morning, and we all piled into the car for another ride. This time, when we got out, we were at the farm. I raced around to smell all the familiar smells. Flare in the barn, Grandma's cooking in the kitchen, the wonderful woodsy tang of dirt and leaves and mushrooms and squirrel and rabbit, and off in the distance, skunk. I ran back out of the woods, waving my tail happily to find the family all gathered on the porch. Don't you want to let Hannah know you're here? Grandma asked. My ears picked up Hannah, the girl? She doesn't want to see me like this, Ethan answered, not looking at anybody. Ethan, Grandma looked shocked, and I saw her and Mom exchange a glance. Don't tell her I'm here, Ethan said. I don't want anybody to know. Honey, just think about it, Mom said in a coaxing voice. Mom, I said don't tell her. Leaning on his cane, Ethan stumped up toward the sleeping porch. My leg hurts. I'm going to lie down for a while. I lay next to the boy for a while since I knew that was my job, but it was hard. All the fantastic farm smells were drifting in through the screened windows of the porch. Both my feet and my tail were twitching. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I bounced up and over to the door of the porch, looking back at the boy to see if he would come with me. Fine, Bailey. The boy heaved himself up and opened the door for me. You go run, he said. At least one of us can. I tore happily around the pasture, sampling one of the brown piles Flair had left there. It still didn't taste like anything much, and then dashing into the woods for an excellent stick and flopped down by the fence for a good chew. When I'd bitten the stick to pieces, I started to head back to the house, but something stopped me. I remembered the walks Ethan and I used to take and ducked under the rails of the fence and took off down the road. We used to go this way together, before Ethan started taking his own car rides, before we went to the football field so often, before Todd and the fire. I trotted along, my nose to the wind, and when I reached a mailbox that sat at the end of the winding driveway, I smelled a familiar smell. I carefully inspected the post that the mailbox was sitting on, in case other dogs had been there before me. A few had. I lifted my leg and let them know that I'd been there too. While I was doing that, a figure came out onto the porch. Bailey? A voice called. Bailey, is that you? It was her, the girl. I dashed up the driveway and arrived for a good ear scratch. You're here, she said. Then is Ethan? She stood still and looked up the road toward the farm. I nudged her hand with my nose to get her scratching again. Then I gave her a lick and started back home. I'd been away from the boy too long. Bailey, wait! Hannah called, and she came running down the driveway behind me. It's always good to have company for a walk. Hannah stayed by my side until we reached the farm. I was about to run back to the house when I spotted Ethan on the dock of the pond, sitting by himself. His cane lay by his side. I ran to him and licked the back of his neck. He jumped, startled. What took you so long, huh, Bailey? He asked. Where did you go? Hannah stepped onto the dock. Ethan must have heard her footsteps and felt the old wooden plank shift under her weight. He got up, painfully, awkwardly clutching his cane. Hannah stopped. I was kind of surprised that the two of them didn't do any of that hugging they seemed to like so much. They didn't do any talking either. They just looked at each other. I sat down to see what would happen next. There was always the possibility of a dog biscuit somewhere. Well, Hannah said, are you going to kiss me or what? Ethan dropped his cane. I thumped my tail on the dock as they hugged and hugged. So they still liked that game after all. I can't believe you didn't even tell me you'd gotten here, Hannah said, with her face against Ethan's shoulder. Bailey had to come get me. Ethan looked down at me, slowly. He grinned. It had been months since I'd seen a grin like that on his face. He jumped into the water. Hannah shrieked with surprise. I raced to the end of the dock and looked down. The water was sloshing. Bubbles were rising. At last, I knew just what to do. I leaped into the water after my boy. In no time at all, I had the collar of his shirt in my mouth. I tugged him up to the surface and we broke into the air. Hannah was sitting down on the dock laughing. I can swim, Ethan shouted, laughing too, shaking the water out of his hair. I can still swim. I was so happy I paddled hard for the little sandy beach by the dock, climbed out, and chased the ducks around the pond. That night, Ethan and I went to bed out on the porch the way we always did at the farm. I lay with my head on my boy's chest, and his hand, heavy and sleepy, came up to stroke my head. Good dog, Bailey, he murmured. For the first time in a long, long time, I could tell my boy was happy.